Nothing on that beat. Nope.
Welcome back to Sports Talk. And as promised, we have got Eric Henry joining us now from Horns 24/7. We're talking about Texas and their first year in the SEC. Might ask him a little bit about Oklahoma as well. I'm sure he knows something about the Sooners. Eric, welcome to Sports Talk. So glad you carved out some time for us.
Not a problem. And listen, anytime you're going to bring me back from break with Not Like Us instrumental, I'm in the right place. So, fellas, I'm more than happy to hop on.
I know we could have let that go. Could have let that roll. There's certain times that you know I'd rather us do a midnight music show. But like I said, we really appreciate it. And Eric, this is to me this is such a fascinating time in college football. We did the first 20 minutes of the show about kind of what we lament that has changed in college football. But wherever it has come from, we're here now, and Texas is joining the SEC. Take us through, if you would, a little bit, as someone that covers the team, which means you're kind of on the inside of it. Tell me, what was it like you started to hear the whispers that this could happen, that this would be a reality, and then when it actually became reality, a reality came to fruition, and you had to do that year where you had to wait?
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, I can tell you this much right now. The excitement on the ground in Austin has been palpable really for about, 24 months. And, of course, for, those who may not know, there was kind of that period where you didn't know if Texas will, not you didn't know, but what year would Texas and Oklahoma join the SEC, right? Because initially was it going to be the 2-year waiting period, or how long was it going to be? But the fact that Texas and Oklahoma both were able to get into the nation's top football conference a year early, the excitement in Austin has been huge. And spinning it forward in terms of just the actual football program itself, Steve Sarkisian, for the longest time, guys, especially the last year entering the final year in the Big 12, Sark wouldn't answer any questions about SEC. It was strictly Big 12, Big 12, Big 12. But now that they've come out of the Big 12, they ended the year obviously with a Big 12 championship and, a Sugar Bowl run coming 17 yards short of playing for a national title game. Steve has been pretty transparent about saying, listen, when I got the job and I knew that this team was going to the SEC, I felt I had to get it SEC ready. He and Cal Flood, offensive coordinator, offensive line coach Kyle Flood, very open and transparent about on our offensive line, we need big humans, big bodies. When you ask Steve about the defensive line, said we need big humans. We need guys who are going to be able to compete in the SEC. So that's just kind of the long-winded way of saying in terms of the fan base, the excitement has been huge. But Steve has really been, in his mind, building a team that could compete not just in the Big 12, but was SEC ready on day one.
Eric, I think it may help that there are some familiar faces, meaning some programs when you go from the Big 12 to the SEC, at least for the old-time Texas fans. No love lost between them and Arkansas. And, of course, you have the Texas A&M rivalry, which will be reborn this year. So there are some teams, and I think the way that Texas perhaps has recruited against teams like, say, Missouri in the past or recruited against LSU and Alabama in the past, it feels like it's not completely new, right? There's some familiarity.
I mean, most definitely. But I'll say this. In terms of the familiarity, I would say that is a little more amongst the fan base more than anything else. Because, you take a look at the roster. None of these kids remember the old Southwest Conference or, the Big 12 when Texas A&M, they were in elementary school, if that, when Texas and Texas A&M were conference mates, right, the last time. So in that sense, some of it doesn't align. But what I will say is this is kind of my takeaway, and I'm not skirting your question, but I think the big thing for me in terms of Texas, I can't speak for Oklahoma, but, I'm a native Floridian, and I always wondered, how would Texas recruit in SEC territory, right? Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana. Guys, take a look no further than their running back recruits. C.J. Baxter, the nation's number one running back recruit last year, kid out of Orlando, Florida. They get a kid, James Simon, this year from Louisiana. They're already expanding their recruiting base, and that's the thing that I think has been super interesting because, when you get around some of the younger kids, right, some of the kids who aren't from Texas, and you ask them about their familiarity with Texas, a lot of it is Steve Sarkisian. Because prior, we all know the down period with Tom Herman, outside the Sugar Bowl appearance, the down period with Charlie Strong, they don't really remember, the Texas, Arkansas, Texas A&M, Missouri. They don't remember that, right? So for them, really their familiarity with Texas is Steve Sarkisian. So I know I kind of took your question in a different direction, but that's really what kind of resonates with me in relation to Texas this year.
No, I think that's absolutely fascinating. Eric Henry joining us, Horns 24/7. You did mention Steve Sarkisian saying he wanted to get this program SEC ready. And one thing that is stark when you watch football on Saturdays is for so long in the Big 12, a different style was played than in the SEC. Now, of course, Texas and Oklahoma, they're talented enough that they would play in bowl games and when the lights were on in neutral fields, and they were able to do things against anybody and step up to that competition in any way. But I do think what's interesting is you've been watching teams like Texas Tech and just so many teams that played a different style than you're going to see in the SEC, especially, say, Georgia, which is on Texas's schedule this year. Is that something that's being discussed, not just getting the roster ready, but the teams you're going to face are going to have a different way of going about playing football?
Oh, listen, that's unquestionably, and I will point no further than last year's Red River Shootout, guys. You take a look, obviously Oklahoma, led by Dylan Gabriel. They have a last second, the second to last drive of the game. They come back and win and beat Texas. But one of the things that sunk Texas in that game, goal line, red zone, short yardage situations. So when Texas lost, and to be honest with you guys, over the past 2 years, quite frankly, Steve Sarkisian, when there have been downs, when everyone in the stadium knows you got to run the football, those third and shorts or fourth and shorts, they've been bad. You take a look at the red zone where they went 1 for 4 against Oklahoma, and I asked Steve Sarkisian about it post game, and he didn't want to talk about it. They struggled in the red zone. Bert Auburn led the nation in field goal makes, not field goal makes, but that was because, quite frankly, they had to settle for threes a lot of times more than sevens. So when you talk about lining up and playing that smash mouth style of football, it's something that after that Oklahoma loss was on the minds of a lot of Texas fans saying, hey, we can't do this against OU. Now, granted, as you said, OU certainly not necessarily your typical Big 12 team, but what are we going to do when we got to do this not only against the Georgias and, Alabamas of the world, but, a team like, Stoops in Kentucky, right? Like they want to line up and play smash mouth football. Are we going to be able to line up and do that? So it definitely was a concern. And when I take a look at Texas's roster, especially, I'll just kind of go quick on the defensive end. You lose guys like Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy, the nation's top 2 defensive tackles. That's certainly interesting. And then their offensive line guys, quite frankly, for as talented they are, returning 4 stars from last year's group, Kelvin Banks, probably a top 10, top 15 pick in the NFL draft coming up. They have something to prove because there are a lot of teams who, quite frankly, think that those guys are finesse. Guys are a little, they hate to use the S word, but a little soft because Wyoming pushed them around for 3 quarters before they were able to break away in that game. Rice was able to get him for 3 sacks. Houston got him for 5 sacks last year. So that's something that they will have to not necessarily address because they're talented enough up front in my mind on the offensive side, but they have to go out there and prove it week in and week out in the SEC.
Now, you say talented, and they certainly are. The recruiting rankings, they certainly tell us that. What are specifically, in your mind, the expectations for Texas, kind of inside and outside the locker room this year? They have, I guess, what, a top, certainly a top 10, maybe a top 5 roster. Are those the expectations, like 11-2 and playoff berth?
Yeah, I'll start with the expectations inside the locker room. Steve Sarkisian, his word is obsessed. He said to the media, I am obsessed with winning a national championship. So there's no doubt that at least inside the locker room, they think that they can carry the baton from last year's team that, again, was 1 drive shy, 17 yards shy of playing for a national title last year. In terms of my expectations, I'll be really honest. And, I made this statement on our show Cover 3 with Bud Elliott and Danny Cannell over on 24/7 Sports. I didn't mean to stir up any head waves, but my opinion is, guys, Texas should be favored in every game this year because there isn't a stadium that they walk into in which they don't have the best quarterback, and that includes when they play Georgia and Carson Beck. No disrespect, but Quinn Ewers, in my mind, is one of the most underappreciated players in college football. So my expectations, I can give you a win-loss number right now. I think they should go 11-1 the regular season. I have them losing 1 game, either to Georgia or Oklahoma. I think they'll beat Michigan week 2. I think the expectation should be that high for this team. They should be at least a top 4 playoff team that gets a first round bye in the college ball playoff. But those are my expectations, absolutely.
That's good stuff, Eric. And, yeah, you mentioned it. I was going to go over the schedule when we let you go. At Michigan, that's certainly a game to watch out for. Mississippi State, the first SEC game. Oklahoma, the Red River rivalry game, which is in mid-October. And Georgia the next week. So maybe if I were to point to something, that may be the stretch, right? Mississippi State, a physical team. Then you've got the emotional game against Oklahoma in Dallas. And then Georgia the week after that. There is a bye week between Mississippi State and Oklahoma.
Right.
But still, Oklahoma and Georgia, nobody would sign up for that in back-to-back weeks.
No, most definitely, guys. But another reason why I feel so confident in Texas' schedule is, again, you take a look. You talked about the front half. Look at the conference schedule. They don't get LSU. They don't get Alabama. They don't get Tennessee. They don't get Ole Miss. They don't get Missouri. Those are all 5 teams that finish in the top 25. You know who does get all 5 of those teams? Oklahoma. And so I tell you right now, I mean, when we talk about 2 teams entering the SEC, those folks from there in Norman, certainly not happy that, their neighbors down south didn't get any of those teams. But to my point about why the expectations in my mind should be so high is no disrespect to some of the SEC teams they do get. But again, as you mentioned, Mississippi State, we'll see what happens with Jeff Lebby and Blake Shapen as far as them rebuilding. They get Vandy, that's kind of rebuilding, right? Arkansas, obviously an emotional, as you talked about, old Southwest Conference game, and then they lost to Arkansas in 2021. So we'll see what happens there. Texas A&M, another emotional game rebuilding, but not necessarily the cream of the crop of the SEC. So I think that more than anything else, that in conjunction with returning a third-year starting quarterback is why the expectations, in my mind, should be where they are.
That was very, very nice of you to say Vanderbilt is rebuilding. That you could just say that every year. Hey, Eric, thank you so much for the time. We may call you back. That was so good, man, and so informative. I love getting, help the way you helped us take the temperature of Texas on the way in. And you're absolutely right to have high expectations. I can't wait for this season. I think we've got some great games ahead of us, and Texas is going to be one of those teams that we're talking about right up until the end.
Hey, more than happy to hop on with y'all anytime.
All right, thank you. That is Eric Henry, Horns247sports.com.